Do you want to learn how you can set up custom queries on your database using AppSync? Well, in this video, that is exactly what I'm going to be teaching you how to do. Hi guys, my name is Sam with Complete Coding, where our aim is to make you into the best AWS and serverless developers that you can be. In this video, we're going to be having a look at our AppSync setup that we've built as part of this project and what we've done since the last video. We're going to be talking through how to set up data sources, how to set up queries, and then how to create custom VTL templates to query our DynamoDB tables directly from AppSync. This is a really cool way of doing things, as it means you don't have to invoke lambdas or other things to query the data for you, saving you a bit of money, which is always nice, and also making sure your code is nice and simple. Also, make sure you stay around till the end, as I'll be announcing something really cool which will be coming up in the future. So let's jump into our code and see what's happened since last week. So in the code, I've made a couple of changes, and the first one of those is actually setting up Cognito. That's because I want a secure way of authenticating all of my endpoints, and Cognito is a really nice service to use. So I've created a Cognito resources file, and I'm importing that into our main serverless.ts. And if we scroll down to the bottom of this, we can see that I'm adding those resources to, unsurprisingly, the resources object. If we actually want to look at the Cognito resources, we can see that we have a user pool, which has a type of user pool, and then we say that we need to verify the email address, and then we have a password policy, which is just the default one that I want to use, so 8 characters, and it doesn't currently require lowercase, numbers, uppercase or symbols. Not super secure, but for now that'll do, and I can update this in the future. If we scroll down, we can also see that we have the username set to equal the email address, and I like to do this because it's easier to remember. I hate having to remember a different username to the email address I signed up with, so why would I make my customers do the same thing? The last thing is we also want to gather their name. This is so that we can address them correctly, and I've set it so that it is not necessarily required, but is also editable in the future if they want to, say, update that setup. So once that's been imported, the next thing we want to do is look at our AppSync API.ts, and this is where the next set of big changes have been made. So I've set up AppSync with the authentication type of the Cognito user pool, and in the user pool configuration, I've actually said this references the user pool that we just looked at, and that is a nice clean way of referencing between separate files. The next thing I did, if we scroll down to the bottom, is define the data sources. So for each of the DynamoDB tables we created in the previous video, I've created a separate data source. This is because with AppSync, we can do some really cool things where instead of having to call a lambda, you can directly query the data in a Dynamo table from AppSync. So for the users table, companies, relationships, posts, published posts, groups and schedules, they all are added as a data source into my system. So if we scroll up, the next thing we really want to talk about is why we're using AppSync and one of the benefits of doing so. So as I just mentioned, you can actually query your Dynamo tables directly from AppSync, which is really, really cool, as it means you don't have to call a Lambda. If you want to call a Lambda, there are Lambda resolvers for the AppSync endpoints, and there are also loads of other different kinds of resolvers. But for this, I'm going to start with the DynamoDB ones and probably add some other ones in the future. To actually query our DynamoDB, we need to add something called mapping templates. And this is just telling AppSync, when you get a query, how do I resolve that? So the first thing I should probably look at is if we find our schema.api.graphql and open that up, I've added a couple of queries here. So we obviously have like getMyUser, which will return a user. We can get a company, we can get an array of companies for a given user ID. And then there's getPosts, getting a list of posts for a company, getting a list of posts for a group, similar requests for the published posts, and then we can get our groups as well, and our schedules based on either a company or a group or just by the schedule ID. So these are the queries we've got. So we actually need to define how we want AppSync to resolve each of these. I'm going to start with a nice simple one, which is getCompany. And if we go across to our serverless and our AppSync.api.ts, we've said that our mapping templates are in the location of serverless/mapping templates, which is just, if I scroll down, serverless/mapping templates. And if I move that up and we open that up, you can see I've been quite busy and I've actually created a lot of different resolvers. But to start off with and show you what these are all about, I'm going to show you some of the easier ones. So if we have a look at getCompany, so this is what it looks like, and it is a .vtl file. And for each query, you need to have a request and a response file. So in AppSync, if we open up our mapping templates and look for this one, so here we're saying that we're going to be doing a query of getCompany. We're using the data source of companies table, which we defined earlier right at the bottom of the file in our data sources. Once we've got this, we can actually define a very specific set of mapping templates, but by default it's going to use type.field.request.vtl, which is what we see here, query.getCompany.request.vtl. And these are some basically boilerplates, basically saying we're doing a get item, and then you need to pass the ID that you're getting on, so that is the key of the field, and then we need to say that we're going to be passing in the argument of company ID. We need to wrap this in this util db to JSON, because DynamoDB stores things in behind the scenes in a very strange way. So we need to change it slightly so that the query works. But for us, we can just think of it as a string. So that's how we are querying our data, or in this case, getting an item from the data. So if we have a look at the response, all we're doing is turning the response, or context.result, into JSON and returning that. That all sounds relatively simple. So if we head over to our actual console, we can have a look at our queries. So if I just move myself onto the other side, then we can see that here are a list of all of the queries that we have. So one of them is getCompany, which we've just defined before. Inside here, we need to pass in a company ID. And to do this, I actually went into Dynamo and just manually made some data. So in here, I have a company with some random test data in there. So when we want to query that, we need to pass in the ID of the company, and we can select which fields we'd like to have back. So we could have back just the company name, but I'm going to say I want the logo and maybe the access token, as well as the ID of whoever owns this. So if I now hit run, this will actually query AppSync with this exact query. It will use that template to query the company's table with that ID, and then it will return us just the fields that we have asked for. So as we can see, when we run that query, we are actually using a logged in user that I've had to create in our user pool. With that user, I'm able to query on company and get back the company name, a company logo URL of null, because in our schema we said it can be null and I haven't populated it in the database. We have an access token of an empty string, and then the owner ID. So that's the first query that we've set up. So if we head over back to our code, we can look at some other common use cases, such as query.getMyUser. And if we find that in our list on the left, getMyUser.request, we can see it looks very similar to the previous request syntax. We're doing a get item, this time on the user ID, but there's something slightly different in the thing that we're passing in. Instead of passing in an attribute, we're passing in identity.username. So this will actually take the ID or the username from Cognito, and it'll pass it into this object, this request, as the user ID. So as long as our user ID in our Cognito database is the same as in our Dynamo table, then we should be able to get back this user ID. If I head back to the set of queries, and in here I can find getMyUser, and in here I want to select just my name and my user ID. If I run this query, it's got my name of Sam Spam Imports and my user ID. These two use cases are relatively straightforward and very common use cases. Another use case, if we go back to our AppSync.ts, is if we want to get a list of something. So for example, if we want to get a list of posts for our company, we can do something like this. We can have our getPosts for company. We're querying on the posts table this time, so not the user or company table. And if we find this, so getPosts for company, there's a little bit extra to this. So at the top, what I've done is added a little if statement saying that if the argument.limit, so if they've passed in how many records they want, and that argument is greater or equal to 25, then that's fine. But if it's more than 25, we say the max limit is 25, and that will return as an error. If we then scroll down, this is actually the bulk of the query. So obviously this time we're using a query operation. And if you've worked with Dynamo before, this might look quite similar, where we're querying saying company ID, which is the key, has a value of :company ID. This then gets dynamically substituted in for this value here. And what we've done here is said that it's going to be dynamodb.toJSON and then context arguments company ID. So that's going to say anytime the field of company ID equals the company ID we're passing in, then return it. Because this isn't actually on the root index, we're actually going to query this on an index called byCompanyGroupDate, where the company ID is the partition key, which is why we need to use an equals. We can also have next token, so if they've got the first 20 and they need the next 20, they can pass in a token which will say, I already have these set, please get me the next set. And also this is our limit, saying this is how many files I want to return. And here I'm using a little bit of extra logic. So I'm saying util.default if null or blank, which basically means, as it kind of says, check this variable, and if it is null or blank, use the other one. This just means you don't have to pass in a limit, but if you do, then it will be used as long as it's passed the test of being less than 25. The last two fields are just saying that we don't want to scan forwards, and consistent read we don't necessarily need. And finally, the select, we want all of the attributes, as we don't know what attributes the end user is going to select, or the consumer of the API, so that is what we are going to use. Once we've queried it, we then also need to make the response.vtl. And in here, we have defined by our schema that it's going to have a set of posts, and it's also going to have a next token. So this happens, and this next token happens if a query runs and it knows there are more results that could have been returned but didn't. In this case, it's going to generate context.result.next token, and in that case we want to give it back to the user so that they can do that thing we described earlier, where they pass that in into the next request to get the next set of results. We're using this default if null or blank again, because if there were only 8 records and they asked for 10, there is no next token, as all of the records that were queryable have been returned. So if we go and have a look at our query for this inside our console, what we're going to do is we're going to go and find getPosts for company. I'm going to pass in the ID of the company I want to query for. And then here, I want to say that I don't want to put a limit or a next token. I want to get the next token if they do return it. So on the actual posts themselves, we want to get context.text, but also might want, say, the group and the post ID for this post. Based on that, if I now hit run, we can see that we have an array of posts. This first post has context of text, this is a post, a group ID and a post. We then have 1 and 2, and that is 2 more of our posts that are connected to this company. So that is how we are going to query on something where we have an ID which returns a list of values, or in our case a page of posts. So if we go back to our code again, we can look at a slightly different kind of query, which is the getPosts for group. And if we look in here and find the request for getPosts for group, we can see that at the top we have the same test again, and this is something I'm going to use quite a lot, which just means that if someone requests and says, I want 1,000 posts, we're not going to be serving those all up in one go, because that's going to really impact our performance of our database, or at least cost us lots of money. So here we have another query, but this time we have slightly more attributes. Again, we're querying on the company group date, and in this one, the sort key, which is called sort key 2. And this is kind of a hybrid key. This SK2 will contain the group ID plus the date. And this just allows you to do things such as querying on just the group, or querying on the group but ordering it so that you could say, get me all of the posts for this group between the date of here and here. And you can do that with some clever ways of querying on that source key. Because we're just getting by group, what we can do is we can say that the sort key begins with group ID. And then here we're passing in the company ID and the group ID. And that is what our query is going to run against. Most of the rest of this is exactly the same. And if we find our response VTL, this is exactly what we saw previously. So if we head over to our inspector and into our console, instead of getting posts for company, we can get posts for group. So here we can paste in our company ID, and the group, I'm going to go with group-1, as that is one of the groups I know exists from some mock data I've created. We also want to get the posts, and this time I just want the text, because I just want to display a list of all of the texts that are queued up for this group. If I now hit query, we get back a list of posts. So here we have context.text for 2 separate posts. This is very similar to the previous one in the response, but the query is more limited. And as you can see, we're querying on the group 1, and we could just change that to group 2. And this time we get a different set of posts. In this video, we've covered quite a few things that we've done since our video last week. We've set up all of our data sources to connect our Dynamo tables to our AppSync, and we've then created a set of high-level queries to be able to query all of those tables. We've done simple queries like getting by ID. We've done getting more advanced things, such as getting a list of posts. This is great for being able to get the first layer of data, but in the next video, we're going to be looking at how you can get the nested things. For example, on MyUser, it has myuser.companies, which allows us to get the list of companies that I have the ability to work on. We also have things like, if I want to look at a group, I actually want to see the list of posts for that group. All of these things are vital to the way that AppSync and, more importantly, GraphQL works. So next week's video is going to be a really important video, and it's going to be super useful for anyone that wants to work with AppSync in the future. As I mentioned at the start of this video, I've got something quite important to announce. In this build series, I'm giving quite a high introductory level to the things that I'm doing to build this SaaS product. But some of you might want more help. You might want to know exactly how I'm designing each of these queries, how I design the schema, or more detail and more information about how these querying templates work. Well, once I've completed this series, I'm going to be making a full in-depth tutorial series teaching you exactly what you need to know to be able to do everything in this SaaS product yourselves. This will cover everything from the querying templates to setting up your account and your infrastructure. And if you're interested in that, obviously it's not yet ready, but in the description below is a link to a form where you can sign up, and I'll let you know when it's ready so that you guys can be the first people to get enrolled on that course. I'm really excited for it, and I hope you guys are too. But anyway, I'll see you in next week's video where we'll be looking at that extra level of GraphQL querying. So thank you, and I'll see you in that video.